He sold my beach house while I was still under anesthesia. I wasn't even out of surgery yet, and my name had already been signed away. By the time I woke up, the ocean breeze I used to fall asleep to had been turned into someone else's profit. And the worst part? It was my own son who let it happen. My name is Evelyn Price. I'm 69 years old, and this is the story of how they tried to erase me. Tell me something. How do you rebuild your life when your own child is the one who locked the door behind you? That hospital room was drenched in this pale, watery morning light, the kind that always made me feel even lonelier. My throat ached from the breathing tube, and something colder than the IV drip had settled deep into my bones. There weren't any flowers on the table, no card, not even a smudge of lipstick left on a coffee cup, just silence and that soft mechanical beeping counting things I never said yes to. I was still trying to figure out if it was Tuesday or Wednesday when Nurse Diane came over with that voice nurses use when they don't want to startle you. She leaned in and said, "Your daughter-in-law stopped by yesterday. She said to let you know the closing went through. Everything went smoothly." Closing? At first, I thought she meant some kind of discharge, like I'd be going home soon. But then it hit me. The closing. The sale. I blinked, tried to sit up, but the edges of the room started spinning. My phone was sitting there on the tray, dead, and the charger was missing. Diane handed me hers. "You've got a voicemail," she said, then stepped outside. And there it was, Nathan's voice, steady and polished, like he was talking to a boardroom. "Everything's taken care of, Mom. We've made the best decision for you. Allison will bring the papers tomorrow. Just focus on getting stronger, okay?" That was it. The message ended. No, I love you, because he didn't say it. Later that day, Allison showed up. She had a manila envelope in one hand, her phone in the other. She didn't ask how I was feeling, didn't sit, just said, "These are the formalities. You'll be more comfortable soon. No stairs, no hassle. We're thinking about your safety." I asked where Nathan was. She said he was busy, but he sends love. Then she walked out, leaving me with papers I couldn't quite read and a mouth that felt like it was full of best. For a little while, I convinced myself maybe it was just the medication. Maybe I was wrong. But then I opened my browser, and there it was, the listing. It said sold, Ocean View Gem. A photo of my porch, the swing I painted myself. Only now it was staged with someone else's pillows. The caption said, "New chapter begins." That's when I knew I wasn't going back. I stared at the screen until the battery died. My hands shook as I pulled the blanket up tighter, like I could wrap myself back into something that felt safe. And then I said it, more to the room than anyone else. They moved me like I was a piece of furniture. But I didn't cry, because something else had started to grow inside me. It wasn't rage, it wasn't panic, it was suspicion. Something about the tone of Nathan's voice, something about how Allison never once looked me in the eye, something about how smoothly it all went. If you've ever woken up in a life that didn't feel like yours, one that someone else rewrote without even asking, then you know what I'm feeling. I know I'm not the only one who's been quietly pushed aside by the people they trusted. So tell me, have you ever had to start over, right at the point when you thought you were done? I'd really love to hear your story in the comments. And if you're still here with me, stay close. The next part, it's not easier, but it's the part where everything begins to shift. The doorknob was plastic, beige, light in my hand, with a tiny scratch across the top. When it clicked shut behind me, it made this sound that felt too final. I stood there for a moment, just inside the entrance of Sunnybrook Assisted Living, blinking under those harsh fluorescent lights. I didn't smell flowers, just lemon-scented cleaner and something that reminded me of overcooked carrots. There was a bowl of sugar-free candies on the front desk, and the receptionist smiled at me like I'd just won something I hadn't asked for. She said, "Welcome, Mrs. Pierce." And I flinched. That wasn't my name. Nathan, standing beside me, cleared his throat and said, "It's Wilson," in this small, quiet voice. The receptionist apologized right away and started tapping at her keyboard, but the name had already stuck. Pierce was Harold's last name, my first husband, a name I hadn't used in over 30 years. It felt like someone had opened a drawer, pulled out an old label, and slapped it on me without asking. Nathan didn't look at me. He just motioned ahead and said with a tired smile, "Come on, Mom, let's show you around." The hallway was painted in this dull green color, meant to be soothing, I guess. Every door had a little seasonal wreath hanging on it, and the bulletin board near the dining room was advertising something called Bingo Bonanza Friday. My feet started moving, but not because I wanted them to. Nathan said, "This is just for a little while, just until you're feeling more like yourself." I wanted to ask him when exactly I'd stopped being me, but I couldn't find the words. Allison met us by a small kitchenette. She was dressed in a sharp blazer, holding a clipboard. "Your room is 2B, Miss Wilson," she said. "Your meals are already planned, low sodium, soft foods. Your medication schedule's by your bed." Then she handed me a slim black phone. "There are 3 contacts saved on here: Nathan, me, and the front desk. If you need anything, just give us a call." I held the phone in my hand. It felt heavier than it should have. Nathan reached out and touched my shoulder, gently, a gesture that might have meant something once. "You'll settle in. Give it time." Then they left, just like that. That evening, someone brought me a small bowl of plain soup, then wheeled the tray away without saying a word. I lay back on the twin bed and stared at the ceiling fan. It clicked softly with every turn. The room was clean, but it felt bare. A picture of a lighthouse hung crooked above the dresser. I tried to remember the last time Nathan had really hugged me. Not just a pat on the back, but a real embrace. I couldn't. Then I heard the soft rustle of blankets. "You don't look like you belong here either." I turned my head. The woman in the other bed had short white hair and a sharp look in her eyes. Her name was Linda. She held out a teacup. "Chamomile," she said, "helps the mind drift, even when the heart won't." I took the cup. My hands trembled just a little. We didn't talk much after that. Around midnight, I sat up and opened the small file folder on the table next to me. Tucked between the meal schedule and emergency contact info was a document titled Incapacitation Preparedness. I skimmed the words, my name, my signature. The date matched the day I'd gone in for surgery. The signature looked just like mine, but I never signed it. I didn't scream, didn't cry. I just stared at the paper, the way you look at a storm cloud hanging on the horizon. Too far away to stop, too close to ignore. Then I heard Linda's voice again, calm and steady from the other bed. "You gonna let them win?" I wasn't going to spend my days spinning slowly in a recliner, half asleep while someone else folded my laundry. Maybe that's what they had in mind, but they clearly didn't understand the quiet strength of a woman who spent her life coaxing green things out of stubborn ground. I know the difference between something that's dead and something that's just resting. The hallway smelled like lemon polish and cinnamon oatmeal. Outside, a soft fog hugged the hedges. The world looked like it was still deciding whether or not to wake up. I moved slowly, not because I was frail, but because I didn't want anyone stopping me to ask where I was headed. Tony was restocking juice cups at the nurse's station. He had kind eyes and a tiny scar above his left eyebrow. I gave him a little wave and said, "Tony, would you mind helping me find my personal things? Just a few small items, sentimental." He paused for a second, then nodded. "Sure, Mrs. Wilson. I think they're in storage. Give me a sec." 10 minutes later, I was sitting back in my room, holding a small canvas bag that smelled faintly of lavender. Inside was my old green notebook, folded and soft from years of use, and a Polaroid photo with curled edges. It was the beach house. The shutters were still blue back then. Nathan must have been 6, racing across the porch with a red plastic shovel in one hand and a peanut butter sandwich in the other. I didn't cry, but my chest ached in that quiet way it does when something you love still exists, just somewhere out of reach. I picked up the phone Allison had given me and called the town clerk's office. I used a voice I hadn't pulled out in years, calm, polite, just the slightest hint of confusion. "Hi, I'm just updating my mailing address. Wanted to make sure you had the correct homeowner listed for 14 Crescent Lane." The woman on the line typed for a moment, then said, "Oh, looks like that was transferred earlier this month. It's under a Marissa Tolland now." I thanked her and hung up before she could ask anything else. That transfer happened 48 hours after I was put under. Just 2 days, and my name was already gone. That afternoon, Linda came over to my chair, holding a peppermint in one hand and a tablet in the other. "Mind if I show you a trick?" she asked as she tapped the screen. "County records, public info. You'd be shocked at what people forget is searchable." Together, we pulled up everything: property transactions, disclosure forms, even town council meeting notes. It was all right there, legal, cold, and ruthless. "They didn't waste time," I said, keeping my voice low. "They never do," Linda replied. That night, I opened my green notebook for the first time in years. I flipped past old sketches, clipped recipes, and a note scrawled in my mother's handwriting. Then I found a blank page. I wrote, "Day 1. They think I'm weak. They'll regret that." I tore out the page and used the desk light to write a letter. It wasn't to Nathan. I didn't have anything to say to him. Not yet. I wrote to Maggie Waller, my neighbor for nearly 25 years, the one who brought me soup after Harold died, the one who helped me hang hurricane shutters the year after. I kept it short. "Maggie, is the house still empty? Just wondering. Love, Evelyn." A week went by. I didn't say a word about the letter, not even to Linda. Then, one gray afternoon, an envelope showed up on my lunch tray. "Evelyn, I saw lights on last night, but not yours." People think nursing homes are quiet, but they're not. There's always some kind of noise, a microwave beeping in the hallway, the squeaky wheel of a cart that never quite rolls straight, a sigh from someone who doesn't know they've been heard. But that morning, the silence between me and my son was louder than all of it. Nathan was sitting across from me in what they called the family visit lounge. It looked more like a cheap motel lobby dressed up with holiday decorations. The fireplace was fake, and so was the cinnamon scent coming from one of those plug-in things near a dusty ficus plant. On the table between us sat a grocery store pumpkin pie, still sealed in its plastic container. "I'm trying my best," Nathan said as he ran his hand through his hair. He couldn't look me in the eye. I didn't answer right away. I let his words sit there, heavy and flat, like the pie. Then I asked, "Did you walk through the house before you signed it away?" My voice was steady, calm, almost gentle. He blinked. "What?" "The house. Did you walk through it one last time?" He looked down at his hands. "No, Mom. Allison handled most of it. You weren't really in shape to..." "To what?" I leaned in. "To own what I built?" He flinched, but didn't say a word. "You told me we'd never sell it," I said. "You said it was too full of summers." Nathan swallowed hard. "Things changed." "No," I said. "You changed." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Look, I didn't come here for this. It's Thanksgiving. I came to see you. I thought we could eat pie and pretend I don't know what you did." He stayed quiet, just stared at that pie like it might give him an answer. I reached into my sweater pocket and pulled out a Polaroid. Nathan, 6 years old, barefoot on the porch, holding a starfish up to the sky like he'd just discovered treasure. His cheeks were sunburned, his smile was crooked. I slid it across the table. "You leave more than just walls behind, Nathan." He stared at the photo, then turned his head away. "You should go," I said, softer this time. He stood awkwardly, his chair scraped against the floor. "I'll come by next week," he muttered. I didn't say a word, just watched him walk out with his hands jammed into his coat pockets, his shoulders hunched like a boy who'd been scolded but never really taught. After the door closed behind him, I stayed in that chair for a while, just watching the electric flames flicker behind those plastic logs. Somewhere near the hallway, I heard two aides talking. One of them lowered her voice to a whisper, but it was too late. I'd already caught the words. "She's the one whose son sold her house, right?" I didn't flinch, didn't move. I just let it sink in, like a bruise you can't see yet, but you already feel spreading under the skin. Later, back in my room, I unfolded the Polaroid again. My hands were steady this time. I traced the edges of the picture and set it gently beside my notebook. Linda was sleeping. The ceiling fan hummed above us. I leaned back and stared up at that ceiling, thinking about the house. The porch still dusted with sand. The chipped tile I refused to replace because I always said it had character. This wasn't the end. It was just the part where people stop noticing, right before everything starts to shift. I didn't cry. I sorted. I stacked up the truth like folded linens, tucked regret under a layer of resolve. Some women break things when they're hurting. Dishes, doors, even themselves. But me? I've always been the kind who rearranges drawers. The common room had been turned into a craft space for the winter. They called it Craft and Quiet. There were glue sticks in bins, yarn tangled like seaweed, and a big cardboard tree taped to the wall. Residents were supposed to hang their intentions on it. Mine was still blank. I wasn't about to turn my grief into a snowflake and pin it up like decoration. Linda sat next to me, glasses low on her nose. She nodded toward the public desktop and asked, "You sure about this?" I said, "They didn't label me disposable, so I'm not going to act like I am." Tony was just a few feet away, running Word Games Hour. He was busy enough not to notice. Linda and I logged in and started searching things like property reassignment, revocable trust, elder home transfer. Her fingers flew across the keys, faster than I expected, especially for someone with arthritis in both thumbs. She leaned over and whispered, "I was a librarian once. People forget, but I don't." Maggie's envelope came mid-morning. It was thick, the kind that feels like it knows more than you're ready for. Inside were printouts of the home's real estate listing, a blurry PDF of the deed transfer, and a note in blue ink. Maggie had written, "It was sold under a trust, not directly. I smelled something fishy the minute I saw Allison's name on the forms." I smoothed out the deed, stared at the font like it might crack open and reveal something. And then it hit me. The health proxy. I'd signed it right before surgery. Nathan had been sitting beside my hospital bed, holding a clipboard and smiling a little too brightly. He told me it was just a formality, in case you can't answer questions while you're out. He said it gently, and I trusted him. I didn't even read it. I left the computer and walked back to my room, quietly. I pulled out a small fabric pouch I'd tucked under my socks. Inside were old papers and a handkerchief with Nate's name embroidered in soft blue thread. I unfolded the clock slowly, like the stitches might speak if I was gentle enough. Still, no tears. I folded it back and placed it beside the deed copy. After dinner, Linda brought her tablet over. She showed me how to look up trust registrations. It took 20 minutes, a couple frozen screens, and one quiet curse, but we found it. The trust was filed a week before my surgery. 2 names were listed. One of them was Allison's. I read it once, then again, then a third time, hoping maybe the letters would rearrange themselves. "They planned this," I said. My voice stayed steady. "Before the pain meds, before the anesthesia." Linda didn't answer. She just reached over and turned off the screen. Then she said, "Sometimes it's not about proving them wrong. It's about proving to yourself that you're not invisible." Outside, the fog had settled in deep. The windows were fogged with cold and the edges of night. I sat at the little writing desk under the bulletin board, opened my journal, and wrote, Day 12. I was never lost. I was sidelined, and that ends soon. I tucked the journal under my pillow and waited. Not for someone to come save me, just for the right moment. If you've ever felt like people were making decisions behind your back, like they were moving you along without asking, then maybe you know what I'm feeling. Tell me, have you ever signed something without really reading it just because someone you trusted told you not to worry? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if you've been following mine, well, it's just getting started. Stay with me, there's more to come. Everyone assumes old women don't know how to use email. And honestly, that's fine. Let them think that. It actually made things easier when I sat there and typed out my first message to attorney Grace Wheeler. I'd been holding the facility's tablet for a good 10 minutes, pretending to scroll through knitting patterns while my fingers hovered just above the screen. Linda was sitting right next to me, flipping through a stack of old catalogs like we weren't quietly planning something bigger. The snow had started early that morning. It was just a mist at first, but by lunchtime, it had thickened into something heavy. The parking lot outside looked like a blank page, clean, waiting. Inside, the common room was full of that usual forced holiday cheer. Someone had turned on a Hallmark movie, and the sound of those fake jingling bells was mixed with coughing and the quiet shuffle of slippers on tile. But in the far corner, right next to the half-lit artificial tree, I tapped send. Maggie had told me about Grace in one of her letters. She wrote, "She helped my sister after her guardianship mess," and underlined it twice. I remembered that name, and I remembered her sister. Quiet but sharp, the kind of woman who refused to be erased. I kept my message simple, just the basics. My name, the surgery, the trust, the house that disappeared, the signature I didn't remember writing. I didn't expect much. But 20 minutes later, she replied, "Meet me, I'll come to you." That night, I started writing everything down. Every single interaction with Nathan, even the short ones. What the nurses said when they brought my meds. Whether Allison responded to my last message. Even the way Linda sometimes looked at me, like she already saw how this was going to end. Documentation is half the battle, Linda said, and she helped me take photos of the documents we pulled from my intake file. We brought them one by one to the activities room and slid them under the harsh light. When Tony asked what we were doing, we told him it was for a photo project we were calling Faces of Aging. He glanced at the lens, then back at me, and just nodded once. 2 days later, I was sitting in that same corner by the tree when Grace walked in. She was shorter than I thought, compact, like she was holding something powerful just beneath the surface. Her boots were covered in salt, and her coat looked expensive but worn, like it had seen a lot. Her eyes didn't wander. They didn't waste time. She sat across from me and skipped the small talk. "You have a case," she said, "but it won't be pretty." I nodded. Then she leaned forward, rested her elbows on her knees, and dropped her voice low so no one else could hear. "How far are you willing to go?" Grace didn't promise miracles. She promised to listen. And honestly, these days, that felt even rarer than justice. We were sitting in the sunroom, though there wasn't much sun to speak of. January had drained the color out of everything, left behind nothing but slush and that dull gray sky that makes the walls feel like they're closing in a little. Grace wore the same coat from before. She had a notepad in her lap and a pen that clicked with a purpose. "You've got options," she said. "None of them simple, but they're real." She laid them out for me, one after another. Financial exploitation of a dependent adult, abuse of medical proxy, improper real estate transfer under duress. Big words, sharp ones, and each one scraped against a place in me I'd kept buried for years under layers of patience and politeness. "First step," she said, "you revoke Nathan's authority immediately. Then I become your legal advocate. just until we get you fully cleared. I nodded. My hand didn't even shake when I signed. Later that afternoon, I saw Linda watching me from down the hallway. Her book was sitting in her lap, still closed. She said, "You look different." I told her, "I feel different." That night, we started practicing. Grace had arranged for an outside physician to come in and evaluate my mental state. If we were going to build a case, I had to be clear. I had to be believable. I hadn't taken a test in decades, but I wasn't about to stumble now. Linda started quizzing me over bowls of oatmeal and cups of Jell-O. She asked things like, "What day is it? Who's the president? Spell February backward." We laughed a little here and there. She was sharper than she let on. At one point, she said, "I taught 4th grade for 20 years. I've seen people pretend they know what they don't. You can't fake what you've got." By the second morning, I could list every address I'd lived at, every birthday that mattered, even the names of all the dogs we had since 1980. "They won't expect that," I said. She smiled and said, "Good. Let that be your opening act." The facility director, Miss Langford, passed me in the hallway that morning and called me Mrs. Pierce again. But this time, there was a different edge in her voice, like someone had told her I wasn't just another woman with a knitting bag anymore. When the evaluation day came, the visiting physician showed up in a wool coat. He had kind eyes. He shook my hand and said, "We'll just talk, that's all." And we did. We talked about my old studio, my garden, the salt that used to crust the porch steps at the beach house. He asked about numbers, memory, names. Then he gave me a word and asked me to define it: resilience. I looked at him and said, "It's what you find in yourself after everyone else has stopped looking." He didn't write that part down, but he smiled. By evening, Grace met me in the hallway. She was holding a printed statement from the physician. Her mouth was set in a line, but her eyes had softened. She read it out loud. "You're more lucid than most people I know under 50. Then she folded the paper and smiled. A real one, the first since I'd met her. "We can file." I sat down on the bench just outside the activities room. The holiday wreath was still hanging there, a little wilted, but still holding on. "They thought I'd forget," I said. Grace looked at me and said, "They were counting on it." But I hadn't, and now they'd have to remember me differently. When you file a claim against your own child, people tend to assume you're just bitter. They tilt their heads, lower their voices, and say things like, "Family matters are best kept private." But bitterness is just grief that never had a place to go, and mine had already been spent. What I had now was clarity. I was sitting in a small conference room at the Legal Aid Center. The wind outside kept slapping the windows like it had something to prove. Inside, the heat buzzed through an old wall vent, mixing with the smell of paper and that burned coffee scent you only get from machines no one's cleaned in years. Grace stood by the table, flipping through the last stack of documents before we filed them. "You don't have to speak today," she said gently. "I know," I told her, "but I will if they let me." The court clerk appeared on a screen in the corner. She wore her hair in a tight bun, spoke in a dry voice, and blinked just a little too slowly. It was only a video call, just the first step, but I still smoothed my cardigan and sat a little taller in my chair. Grace started reading the claim out loud. Elder financial exploitation, fraudulent use of a medical proxy, unlawful real estate transfer. It sounded clinical, like we were listing ingredients on a cereal box, but every word cut deep. Then came the rebuttal. Nathan and Allison didn't even bother to show up. Their lawyer submitted a typed response. According to them, I had consented to the trust willingly in a documented state of full awareness. I pressed both palms flat on the table. Grace kept reading. She didn't look at me. "They allege that your declining health necessitated a streamlined legal process." I said quietly, "They mean I was inconvenient." We submitted everything. My journals, notes I'd written before the surgery, photos of document timestamps, copies of my signature from that year next to the one on the trust. Different ink, different pressure. Off, just enough. Linda had helped organize it all, color-coded folders like we were back in school again. When the hearing date was announced, just 3 weeks away, Grace raised an eyebrow. "They're expediting it," she said, "probably because of your age." I didn't blink. Good. I'm not looking to drag this out. I want them to feel time the way I felt it. That evening, back in my room, a nurse handed me an envelope. No return address. My name printed in that cold, machine-perfect font. Evelyn M. Pierce. Inside was one typed sentence. "You're confused. Let's not make this ugly. Nathan." No warmth, no memory, no apology. I stared at the paper for a few seconds, then folded in half. Then again. I walked down to the dining area. Dinner had just started. Tomato soup. I sat down, tore the letter into even strips, and dropped them into the bowl. The ink started to bleed, like it belonged there. I stirred slowly. Each circle of the spoon felt like a sentence I didn't need to say out loud. Across from me, Linda watched quietly, her tray still untouched. After a while, she leaned in and whispered, "That's the bravest thing I've ever seen." I didn't say anything. I just lifted the spoon and took a bite. It tasted like resolve. The court date was already on the calendar, circled twice in Grace's careful handwriting. But truth is, the real fight had already started. It began with whispers, quiet conversations that stopped the second I entered a room. Staff who used to chat with me while changing the linens now smiled too quickly, too wide. One aide mumbled, "She's the one with the lawyer, right?" Like I was carrying something they didn't want to catch. But I knew they were really getting nervous that Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting near the nurse's station, reading, or at least pretending to, when I heard the receptionist pick up the phone. She said, "Yes, she's resting comfortably. Yes, mentally stable. Well, she writes in a journal every day, so I'd say she's sharp." Then her voice lowered. "You're her daughter, right, Allison?" I put the book down. That was the moment it became clear. They weren't just protecting themselves anymore. They were trying to tear me down. I told Linda. She didn't even blink. "We'll record everything," she said, slipping a tiny device under the corner of my bedside drawer. "Let them explain themselves later." Nathan called that night, not in person, just his voice through the phone, wrapped in that same practiced charm. "You're being manipulated, Mom," he said. "Grace just wants a headline. You know how lawyers are." I didn't say a word. I just held the phone steady until his voice lost its rhythm. Then I hung up. The next morning, Grace sent me a thick envelope. Inside was a printed timeline. The day of me surgery, the day the trust was filed, the day the house was listed. She'd highlighted everything in yellow, one square after another, each one quiet but loud in its own way. I spread the papers out across the dresser and pulled out old photos. The porch of the beach house covered in snow. A for sale sign I hadn't even known was there. A Christmas picture of Nathan and Allison drinking cider while I was still in recovery. It didn't hurt anymore. It just made things clearer. That evening, I wrote a letter. Not to Nathan, to myself. I am still her, the woman who made something out of nothing, who sewed every curtain by hand, who stacked cans in straight, sensible rows. I am still her. I folded that note into a small square and tucked it into the pocket of my cardigan, right over my heart. On the morning of the video deposition, I pulled out my old scarf, the blue one with tiny white threads that shimmer when the light catches them just right. I'd worn it to every big meeting back when I ran the studio, and for the first time in months, I put on lipstick. When Linda saw me, she took a breath. "You look like someone who wins," she said. I nodded. That's the plan. I walked into the common room with my shoulders back. The television was playing one of those court shows again, volume turned low. A nurse I didn't recognize looked up as I passed. She leaned toward another and whispered, just loud enough, I wouldn't bet against her. Neither would I. And if you've ever had to prove you weren't who they said you were, just to be heard, I'd really love to know how you did it. Leave me a comment, even just a few words. Sometimes hearing from someone who understands, it changes everything. And if you're still with me, stay close. Next time, I finally get to speak for myself, and not everyone is ready to hear what I have to say. The screen flickered, and there he was, Nathan, a little blurry behind his lawyer, sitting in that small courthouse window that popped up on the monitor. My son, but he looked more like a stranger wearing a nice jacket. The room where we held the video deposition smelled like old coffee and pencil shavings. I'd already been sitting there 20 minutes, knees stiff, ankles crossed, like I was back in Sunday school. The fluorescent lights overhead made everything feel a little too awake, a little too sharp. Grace sat next to me, calm as always. Her fingers rested lightly on her legal pad. On the other side of the screen, a court stenographer began typing. The soft clacking of the keys came through the speaker like a slow, distant rhythm. A voice said, "Mrs. Pierce, whenever you're ready." I nodded, folded my hands in my lap, and began. My name is Evelyn Pierce. I am 71 years old. In November of last year, I underwent surgery. During that time, my house, the home I built and lived in for over 30 years, was sold without my full knowledge or true consent. I kept going. I laid out the timeline, step by step. When the trust was created, when my name vanished from the deed, when Allison's name suddenly showed up where it never belonged. Then I read from my journal. The day after Rick's funeral, Nathan brought me soup. He sat at the edge of my bed, held my hand, and said, "You'll always have me." I believed him. My voice stayed steady, but I noticed my left hand shaking just a bit as I turned the page. I closed the journal slowly and set it down on the table. Grace took over, lifting copies of documents for the record. "We have evidence here of signatures that do not match known samples from Miss Pierce," she said, "and a sale executed within 72 hours of the trust's creation." Allison's lawyer cleared his throat and tried to object, something about emotional bias. Grace didn't even pause. She leaned forward and said, "Let me remind the court that emotional bias is not the same as emotional harm. My client was harmed." That quieted the room. Nathan still hadn't said a word. He just sat there, arms folded, eyes down, like he was waiting for someone else to carry the weight. I didn't cry, not once. But when it came time for my closing statement, I looked right at the screen, right at him. "You always said you hated public speaking," I said, "but now you're silent where it matters most." He didn't move. I reached for the printed copy of my statement, folded it in half, then into quarters. My hand had stopped shaking. And just before the session ended, I said one last thing. My voice wasn't loud, but it reached. I taught him better than this. The room went quiet. Even Grace didn't say a word. On the screen, Nathan finally looked up. His eyes met mine. But he didn't speak. Not a word. No apology, no defense, just silence. And it was heavier than anything else that had been said. In that moment, I didn't feel victory or even closure. What I felt was clarity. Because something honest had finally been spoken, out loud, in front of people who couldn't pretend they hadn't heard it. 2 weeks had passed since I gave my testimony. I was expecting delays, maybe appeals, or just silence. But that morning, when Grace called, there was something lighter in her voice. Then she said 5 words I hadn't prepared for. "You can go home tomorrow." At first, I thought she was kidding. I asked her to say it again, and she did, only softer this time, like the words were too fragile to speak out loud. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. I folded the same cardigan 3 times. I taped a note to Linda's door that said, "Pack your sass, we're leaving at dawn." Then I cried for exactly 7 minutes, quiet, into my pillow. Then I stopped. The judge's ruling was clear. The sale had violated elder protection laws. I wouldn't get everything back, but I'd get what mattered. I could live in my house again. I'd receive partial financial restitution, and my name was going back where it belonged. Allison disappeared from the picture, like smoke. Nathan left me a voicemail the night before I left Sunnybrook. I didn't answer it. I didn't need to. His voice cracked in the recording. "I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know what to say." I know. Tony handed me a blueberry muffin as I walked out. "Don't tell the kitchen," he whispered. "I stole the good ones." I hugged him, and I was surprised by how tightly he hugged back. Linda rolled her suitcase beside mine. "If you think I'm going back to bingo nights, you're sorely mistaken." She was smiling, but her voice wobbled a little. "Thank you for not giving up." Grace drove us, windows down. Spring had finally arrived in Rhode Island. The peonies were blooming along the highway. The air smelt like salt and pollen. I hadn't breathed that deeply in months. We got there just after noon. The siding looked the same. The mailbox leaned a little farther. The porch railing still had the nick from when Nathan crashed his tricycle into it the year he learned to ride. I stepped out slowly. My knees remembered the way, but they questioned the weight. Inside, the kitchen smelled different. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. The lemon oil I used to clean with was gone, replaced by something cold and sterile. I opened a few drawers. Some were empty. Others still had little labels written in my handwriting. Cloves, star anise, tape rolls. Then I saw it, my old recipe tin, sitting on the counter. I lifted the lid, and tucked between the peach cobbler card and Rick's barbecue rub was a note in Maggie's handwriting. "You're not alone. Call me if you need a ladder or a laugh. M." I pressed the tin to my chest. What I felt wasn't anger anymore. It was recognition. I walked to the back door and opened it wide. The wind moved through the house like it was blessing every room. The curtains shifted. The cabinets gave a little creak. Somewhere upstairs, I swear the walls remembered the lullabies I used to hum. Grace stood quietly in the doorway. "Want me to help unpack?" I shook my head. Not yet. I reached into my bag and pulled out the little lavender plant Linda and I had started in a plastic cup. I set it gently on the windowsill. Then I whispered, just loud enough for the house to hear me, "This time, it's mine." It didn't come back all at once, that feeling of home. It showed up in pieces, in how the floor warmed under the morning light, in the smell of rosemary by the kitchen window, in the silence that, finally, didn't ache anymore. Last week, I got a letter, no return address, just a small envelope, a little worn at the edges. Inside was a photo, me and Nathan, 1992, standing on the boardwalk in Narragansett. I had my sunglasses pushed into my hair. He was holding a bag of cotton candy, half melted. There was no note, just the picture. I didn't frame it. I didn't throw it away. I slid it into the drawer next to the stove, tucked beside the can opener and the old measuring spoons. Some grief isn't meant to be fixed. You just give it a quiet place to rest. I started baking again. That first loaf came out lopsided, but the smell, that smell almost brought me to my knees. I sliced it, wrapped half in wax paper, and walked it down to the library. Left it on the bench out front with a little note that said, "Still here." Maggie called that night. She said, "You're ridiculous," and then she laughed. And sweet, like cinnamon raisin. We meet on Zoom now, every Tuesday night. It's her writing group. Last week, I read my first piece out loud. I called it How to Reclaim a Front Porch. I wrote about paint colors, about sanding wood with my bare hands, about the difference between sitting alone and sitting in peace. No one interrupted. When I finished, there was this long silence. Then Maggie said, "You've always been writing. You just didn't know it." Linda came to visit the weekend after. She brought iced tea and a plastic flamingo she named Ralph. We sat on the porch with our feet up, the breeze catching our sleeves. "We should start a podcast," she said. call it revenge is a cup of chamomile. I laughed harder than I had in months. In June, I walked the beach again. No cane, just my sandals and a good breeze. I didn't cry. I didn't even slow down when I passed the bench Rick and I used to sit on. The tide was coming in, soft and steady. I took a picture of myself, my very first selfie, hair wild from the wind, eyes clear. I sent it to Maggie with one word, standing. That night, I sat on the porch with the radio low. The stars were out, sharp and quiet. And I thought about how many different versions of myself I've had to become just to keep going. The daughter, the mother, the widow, the forgotten, and now, me. I don't know if Nathan will ever write again. I don't know if the house will always feel this calm, but I do know this. No one calls me disposable anymore. No one files me away. The porch creaked softly behind me as I leaned forward and spoke into the stillness. If you're listening, I said, tell me, have you ever come back to something they said you'd lost forever? And then I let the night hold that question, just long enough for someone to answer. Coming home didn't fix everything, but standing in my kitchen again, with the light falling just right and the bread rising in the oven, I remembered something. Healing doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Family should be where you feel safest, not silenced. And sometimes the hardest thing isn't being betrayed. It's choosing to stay soft, choosing to stand tall without turning bitter. We don't always get justice the way we pictured it, but dignity, that's still ours to claim. If any part of this story reminded you of something in your own life, I'd love to know. Just share a moment, a thought, a memory, because we're not as alone as they made us feel. And if your heart's still open, the next chapter is waiting. It's called My Son Sent Me a Box of Cookies for My Birthday and warned, accusations don't end well. Let's see what happens when the past returns, not with flowers, but with a warning.